Bannerlord's factions aren't fantasy. They're reflections of real warriors, real kingdoms, and real cultures pulled straight out of history. In this video, I'm going to be diving into the western and southern factions of Khuzaits and uncovering the real groups that inspired them. This is part 1 of a 2-part series, so the northern and eastern factions will be covered in part 2. Let's start with Vlandia. So the Vlandians are very heavily inspired by the Normans of northern France, kind of around the 11th century. The Normans were descended from Vikings, but they adopted French language and culture and a very strict feudal system, which is really evident in Vlandia. So we're going to start with Vlandia's military, and you can really see how closely it lines up with the Normans. The main focus on heavy cavalry is kind of quite accurate because the Norman knights were definitely some of the most effective mounted warriors in medieval Europe, with their kind of shock charges, kind of couching lances, which is very well reflected in Bannerlord, and the kind of mail armor and helmets that you kind of see on pretty much all of the Vlandian knights is quite kind of that Western European aesthetic, which is very kind of heavily inspired by the Normans. The Normans, like, they did use crossbows, but I think the kind of one issue here is that Vlandia leans into crossbows very heavily. I mean, it's only the mercenary units that don't have crossbows, so they all have crossbows, which is a slight exaggeration because the Normans didn't just solely have crossbows, and the crossbows were quite kind of slightly newer to Europe, kind of around the time period when the Normans were most kind of iconic, and when I'd say they're majority based off of in this game. So the crossbow connection is there, but I think it was mostly for gameplay variety that Tailwells decided to make kind of Vlandia kind of solely crossbows, just to make them slightly more interesting to play as. And then you've got another similarity, which is definitely the kind of combined arms approach. The Normans definitely were great kind of users of this combined arms approach of infantry, archers, and cavalry, and kind of this kind of way of fighting was definitely what helps them win, say, the Battle of Hastings. It was a lot down to their combined arms approach. And kind of the other kind of key point to note is that Vlandia is definitely one of the most like feudalistic of the factions, and that reflects the Normans quite well because the Norman military power just kind of came from the land-holding nobles. And you can say that about a lot of factions in Khuzaits, but I do feel like Vlandia is kind of the most feudalistic, with the society of knights, barons, vassals. Very well reflects how the Normans, you know, who were extremely feudalistic, how they worked, and kind of those systems would then be implemented in France and England. So the armor of Vlandia also very well aligns with the Normans and definitely took extreme heavy inspiration from. You're looking at the conical helmets, you're looking at like the nasal guards, you're looking at kite-shaped shields. They're just all following that early medieval Western European style that the Normans were really well known for. And the way just their knights are presented with kind of their surcoats as well, definitely you can so clearly make so many links between any Vlandian unit and their Western European heavily Norman counterpart. Also, the lore of Vlandia quite nicely reflects the history of the Normans, because the Normans actually started as Viking settlers and kind of worked as mercenaries before being given land in the northern France. Now, this works quite well with Vlandia, as Vlandia were obviously kind of mercenaries for the Empire before being given land in the West and allowed to create their own kingdom. So it's quite nice, that kind of lore link of how Vlandia is definitely inspired by the story of the Normans. And as well, how the Vlandians act in the game is also quite similar, because Vlandia kind of always quite likes to push into, you know, east into Battania and try and take over the Battanian lands. Now that does reflect how the Normans would expand and attack, you know, England, Wales, Scotland, Ireland, which is kind of where Battania is based off of. And so kind of, even with the geography of Vlandia, the fact that they're on the western side of the map quite nicely reflects like Normandy, Brittany, and and the fact they're next to Battania as well kind of aligns with how they would go on to expand, obviously, into the British Isles. So kind of when you put this, you know, the armor and the lore and their direction of expansion, you can kind of quite piece together the story of how Vlandia is kind of a rerun of the Normans, you know, yeah, not just in their military, but in also how they kind of have been represented in the game. So at a first glance, it's pretty obvious that the Empire is meant to represent the Romans, but it's important to know which Romans or which time period of Romans they're representing. I think, and I think it's pretty obvious to see that the Empire is much more based around the Byzantine Empire than anything earlier like the Roman Republic or the Western Roman Empire. I think that kind of this was done intentionally to match the more medieval, obviously, aesthetic of the game and the time when it's set in technologically wise, as the Byzantine Empire obviously then extends through those Middle Ages. So I definitely think, and the military, definitely, with kind of the armor and its overall aesthetic of the units, much more Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantine influenced than kind of maybe the more traditional kind of earlier Romans that you might have in your head. They haven't based it on that. They based it much more on the later surviving Eastern Roman Empire. So the military of the empire is very closely linked to the Byzantine Empire. And it's kind of as well talks about in the lore a little bit. If you look at the Legion of the Betrayed, it talks about the lore of how the empire used to have a standing army, and that kind of very well reflects the Byzantine kind of Roman way. It's not necessarily feudal, of kind of rallying up troops with your vassals, nobles, whatever. It's much more about having standing professional kind of armies, which I know kind of might not be the system of how it works in Bannerlord, but that kind of earlier lore point is really important. And then obviously you have their extreme focus on heavy infantry. Now this really works with what the Byzantines did. If you think about units like the Scutate, who were kind of very heavy infantry, large shields, and kind of disciplined formations, which lead on from those earlier Roman ideas, but are definitely with the whole aesthetic lean into the Byzantine. And then you have the cavalry, so obviously you're thinking cataphracts from the cataphractae of the Byzantines, just very high-powered, heavily armoured horsemen. You also have to think about maybe the horse arch unit. You have the Bucellari, taken pretty much directly from the Byzantines. So it's kind of just, they've really made sure to emulate a much more kind of Greek fighting style, because I'll reference that map of the Roman Empire. I'll see if I can find it. But it basically just shows how the Romans, for the majority of their time, were kind of just in Greece. So naturally, a lot of these units, very Greek-inspired. Again, like I was saying with the Vlandians, a kind of focus on a combined arms approach. I definitely get that feeling with the Empire. You want to be bringing the mixture, it's not, their archers don't like overshine them, their infantry is kind of, and their cavalry are great and don't overshine each other, and they all just kind of work in a synergy, which I think is quite, reflective of what the Byzantines were like. So the armor and equipment of the Empire and Bannerlord is also very similar to the Byzantines. You're thinking like the lamella armor, the scale armor, and their infantry also have the large oval shields, which is quite similar to the Byzantine infantry. The cataphracts using those heavy lamella plates, crested helmets as well, and kind of their horse armor is quite reminiscent of the Byzantines. The color palette as well is a really important thing to note. You're looking at those purples. Now, purples were very rare in the medieval times, so the Byzantines, as they were the wealthy Romans, they were kind of able to afford this, and so don't let that point go amiss. Like, the Empire is showing its wealth by equipping its troops with purple dyes in their armor. So the lore and culture of the Empire is also very kind of directly inspired by the Byzantines. Obviously, they have the civil war going on in the Empire, and this was definitely inspired by the division of Rome into Western and Eastern. Also, kind of culturally, the focus on the kind of urban and bureaucratic systems, and the high number of kind of villages that the Empire does have probably is a representation of how Roman culture was spread very widely across Europe and the Middle East. And then you also do have the geography of the Empire. Obviously, it sits at the center of Calradia. Now, this was kind of a gift and a curse, as obviously you have great trade routes, but you're surrounded by a lot of enemies. And this was the case with the Byzantines. As kind of where they were in Greece and parts of Turkey, they were pretty much at the center of kind of the known world in that area with the Middle East and Europe. So it kind of represents how the Byzantines were kind of very, the center of civilization, but ultimately would just be kind of, it's probably not the main reason for their fall, but they were exposed on lots of fronts, and that's well represented within Bannerlord. If you are enjoying this Bannerlord historical inspirations video, please consider liking and subscribing for future Bannerlord content. The vast majority of you are not subscribed, so if you could subscribe, it would really help me out and support the channel. Thanks to everyone who's already subscribed. Also, if you'd like to talk about anything I discuss in this video, or you'd like to help out with future videos, please consider joining the Discord server. The link will be in the description as always. Moving on to the Battanians, who are pretty clearly inspired by the Gaelic and Celtic peoples of northwestern Europe during the early medieval period. So this kind of consists of homelands of dense forests and rugged hills, which pretty much reflect the landscapes of Ireland, Scotland and Wales, which is kind of where the Celtic people had been pushed back to by the time period where Bannerlord is set. This kind of creates the cultural kind of lore identity of the Battanians as pretty much a reflection of how the Celtic groups were existing in medieval Europe pretty much around the 10th, 11th centuries. The military of Battania aligns very closely with how the Gaelic and Celtic peoples fought, especially in the early medieval period. They very often relied on using the terrain to their advantage, opting to fight in forests and hills, narrow passes, and using ambush tactics. That's pretty much what kind of the Gaelic Celtic people were known for, and the Battanians definitely play into this with their bonuses in woodland terrain. They also focus heavily on light mobile infantry, so kind of sacrificing armor for that speed, which was another key strategy of Gaelic Celtic forces. And they use javelins, spears, and kind of just flexible tactics to help them tire out and wear down larger, maybe better equipped armies. They also rely quite a lot on shock infantry with large weapons, so you're looking at weapons such as like falxes, long swords, so they're not really like heavy infantry, but kind of you're looking at units like the veteran falxman that are designed as kind of pure shock infantry, was also kind of a good strategy of the Celts. And again, kind of Battania plays into that limited cavalry tradition, because the Celts did use, I would say they used chariots, so they did definitely use cavalry, but it's not kind of the heavy cavalry that I would say you see in, like, Vlandia with the Normans. It's not really heavy cavalry, it's more kind of for mobility, so the cavalry had less of, like, a direct impact in, like, charges or anything like that, and kind of just the overall warrior culture of extreme focus on honor and like heritage was very, very like influential in Celtic armies. So I think though it's the lore of Battania that really plays the most into the Celtic and Gaelic stories, as kind of before the medieval times, the Celts and the Gaelic peoples were very common across Europe, especially like even in Central Europe. They were very common in Germany and France, but they gradually were displaced by other groups and kind of forced further and more northwestern as they went, whether this be by the Romans, pushing them up out of Germany and France especially, or you had the Anglo-Saxons that pushed them kind of out of England. These Celts kind of often felt their lands were kind of being taken, like their, ancestral homelands, and this is really kind of represented in Bannerlord, as the Battanians are extremely fearful of the Empire or Vlandia, entering their forests and removing their traditional ways. So it kind of just really works with the whole story of Battania. They're very tied to the forest, tied to their traditions, and they just want to defend kind of their homelands. Because, by the medieval point, the Celts, they'd been pushed back to only a couple of, nations. You got Scotland, you got Wales, you got Ireland, and they were really just kind of becoming a less dominant force as they struggled to maintain their kind of control on their homelands. The geography of Battania also links to the Celtic and Gaelic peoples where they were living in early medieval Europe. You're looking at the dense forests and kind of the boggy terrain, which made this terrain kind of quite inaccessible to their enemies and acted as natural defenses. But the problem was it made their settlements quite rural and scattered. Kind of you're looking at the hill forts and kind of wooden homesteads, that they kind of weren't in a position to make large cities anymore, which you can kind of see in Battanian architecture. It's very kind of wooden and much kind of less developed than, say, the concrete structures of the Empire. But, Battania's geography as well, their kind of position as they feel like they've been pushed up into the northwest, into probably a region that no one else really wanted to settle in. you know? And so that kind of just helps with the story of the fact that the Celts were also kind of pushed out of the more central regions of Europe and up into the more remote areas of kind of Ireland, Scotland, Wales. So the Aserai are an interesting faction in Bannerlord because they're mostly inspired by a group that kind of predates many of the other groups that Bannerlord is inspired by, as the Aserai take most of their inspiration from the Arabic tribes that existed before the Islamic conquests of the 7th century. So their political system revolves much more around kind of family loyalty rather than to a centralized state, and this is kind of represented in their political system, as they do have like clan feuds, and their leader is mostly kind of elected on honor and reputation rather than kind of their heritage. So militarily, the Aserai are very similar to the Arabian tribes, and their kind of approach mostly comes down to high mobility and making use of their kind of desert survival skills. They would use light cavalry a lot and attack enemies at range with, say, javelins, and they would also use horse archers, which is kind of again represented in the Aserai and Bannerlord, and these horse archers would be used to harass enemies and kind of control the open terrain that was the desert of much of Arabia. You also had obviously camels and camel riders. Obviously, camels were had a much higher survivability in the desert than say horses, and were also a lot kind of bulkier as well, so they made quite good cavalry. And then you had infantry as well, which was quite lightly equipped, mostly relying on spears, shields, and kind of throwing weapons such as javelins. And the Aserai troop tree does kind of mirror this quite well, as a lot of their units are a lot more lightly armoured. And as well, another parallel I want to make is kind of with the Corsairs. So you have the kind of the Corsairs, which might not have been kind of, they're not obviously part of the Aserai, but they are from the same kind of area. And I do think the Corsairs, quite, you know, their inspiration definitely came from the Barbary pirates of North Africa. And I think that's kind of also an interesting link to make between kind of that, how that region of Bannerlord is definitely trying to reflect the majority of the aspects of kind of Arabia and North Africa at the time kind of when the game is set. So, the lore of the Aserai and Bannerlord also ties in very nicely with pre-Islamic Arabia, as it kind of focuses on the fact that the Aserai society is built around clans instead of a central authority. Each of the clans have their own agendas and internal leaders, and it is kind of up to the Sultan to make sure to balance these clans, to make kind of they're not ruling them outright. They need to kind of balance their interests and make sure that they don't, you know, fight each other. And this kind of is pretty accurate to how the Arabian tribes would operate, as they would have constantly shifting alliances and wars and blood feuds. And the economy as well is pretty nice because it's an economy that's very much focused on trade, which is centered around the production of luxury goods that might not exist in areas that aren't, you know, desert. And then there's also the integration of lifestyle between the more nomadic kind of lifestyle of the Jawals compared to the oasis and more urbanized lifestyles of the coastal cities. And I think that's quite a good representation of the diversity and variety that was going on in Arabia at the time, as you did have these more built-up cities and tribes, whereas you still also had the more desert nomadic lifestyle. So this kind of, when you pair the economy with kind of the way that the politics and of the Aserai is working based off of clans and kind of internal disputes and aspirations, is kind of quite a good representation of Arabia. So the Aserai's geography is a great kind of representation of Arabia, as it is mostly desert, but it is broken up by, you know, the oases and settlements. They also have that great kind of sea access to the southern kind of sea, which is basically just the Mediterranean. They also kind of have, obviously the Aserai have that desert movement bonus, which is a good representation of how the like Arabian tribes would make use of their terrain as kind of, say, like maybe invading armies. I don't know, say like the Romans would definitely struggle if you don't know the terrain and you get caught out in the desert. So it's kind of nice to see how, you know, the more, you know, the native kind of like Aserai Arabian troops have that kind of local advantage that really helps them in warfare. Okay, so that was how the Western and Southern Bannerlord factions have been inspired by real historical groups. Let me know what you thought of the video, if you enjoyed it, if there's anything you disagree with me on or you think I missed, let me know in the comments. I'm always trying to improve. Also, stay tuned for part 2 because I'll be doing the Northern and Eastern factions next. Make sure to like and subscribe and join the Discord server if you haven't already. That is it from me, goodbye and thank you for watching.